start recording. All right. And let me pick up where I left. I just remember that I was not recording. Sorry, guys. Okay. So I was saying that this is a very important critique because it's coming from a very important and influential multinational organization as the United Nations against two very important and influential organizations, the World Bank and the IMF. So, I mean, when you think about it, I mean, this is not coming from a government in the third world, from Africa or a particular country. No. This is coming from a very important group. Anyway, the second challenge is what we briefly have discussed as the unification of the South. So, like I explained before, there have been different attempts over time where, you know, poor economies or developing economies, rather than trying to get close to rich economies, they said, you know, again, dependency theories should resonate right now. We should be joining forces again among ourselves. Rather than going south-north, we should be going south-south. So in the eyes of Latin America, this should be within Latin America, reach out to Africa, reach out to Southeast Asia, you know, reach out to other developing regions, because we are on the same boat, or at least on a similar boat. We're aiming for the same thing. We are suffering from the same things. Unfortunately, like I said, this idea has not been very successful for reasons that we are going to keep exploring later. But again, the idea is, you know, I'm highlighting this number 5, regional integration and cooperation. That's the key of this criticism. You know, you guys in the North have a very, you know, have control over powerful organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, and you just control them to advance your interest. You know, you act as if you were, you know, pursuing the interest of every citizen around the world, but that's not true. That is not true. You are using the institutions, these multilateral agencies, as instruments, as tools to achieve your goals. All right, we can debate this or not, but that's the argument. You know, you know, I'm talking about on behalf of the Southern Consensus people. We need to join forces, and we need to figure out ways to counterbalance this significant amount of political and financial power that these guys have. Obviously, you know, the IMF and the World Bank didn't like this criticism. You know, they said, what are you talking about? You know, many people could argue that in an attempt to save face, in an attempt to rescue the reputation of these institutions, you know, they said, okay, wait a second, guys, you know, you're taking this the wrong way. In 1997, by the way, the World Bank has what we call a flagship publication. The most important document that comes out every year from the World Bank is called the World Development Report. In 1997, they issued this report where they start talking about a transformation within the institution, moving away from, okay, market is good, state is bad. Of course, you know, 17 years later after Ronald Reagan and 17 years later after Margaret Thatcher, you know, things were changing, obviously. So this rhetoric of, you know, the government is not the solution, but the problem itself, or, you know, all of these type of statements, even the World Bank starts saying, okay, guys, we realize that we need to take care of everybody around the world. This is the mission of our organizations. By 2000, 2001, there was another document that actually was called Attacking Poverty. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but at the time, there was there is a very famous economist by the name of Joseph Stiglitz, and I am highlighting this on the screen, Stiglitz. That was one of the thinkers within the bank that was antagonistic, that was, the dissenting voice within the bank, facing people like David Dollar and, other economists within the bank. But Stiglitz was the chief economist. And this created a huge amount of friction, a huge amount of confusion within these institutions, because Stiglitz was a very well-known economist, to the point that he was fired. Stiglitz was let go. He was dismissed. They said, we don't want you here anymore. And interestingly enough, Stiglitz stepped down for a few years, only to later, I don't remember the year, receive the Nobel Prize in economics. So, it was an interesting turn of event for Stiglitz, for the institution. But the point is that the IMF and the World Bank went through a period of internal discussion where some economists were opposing the policies of the bank and the IMF themselves against, the traditionalists, right? And well, that produced that some heads roll, like Stiglitz head. Now, some people argue that because of that, because despite the fact that for a while it looked like these institutions were developing a conscience, a serious economic, sustainable development conscience, despite of that, these goals, although they claim they pursue them, in practice they are not. And again, the criticisms go back to things that I already explained. The $1, one vote metrics, the fact that the head of the IMF is always European, the head of the World Bank is always American. There has never been anybody from the developing world, calling the shots at these institutions, right? So, when you talk about democracy, representativeness, they don't have, unfortunately, the moral ground to say, oh yes, we are letting everybody to participate equally. Well, there is no transparency, accountability is very strange, because the IMF and the World Bank are supranational agencies. By supranational, I mean that no law, they don't have to obey the law of any particular country. The US law doesn't govern the IMF or the World Bank or the European Union. No, it's a supranational entity that is not governed by any particular law. So accountability, transparency, all of these things are lacking. And, there are many voices, even today, calling for a profound transformation of the structure, organization, and the governance of these institutions. Is this going to happen? Unlikely, but possible. So we'll see. Here on this square on the screen, I have two so-called global watchdogs. If you go to these websites, I think they are still active. You can follow some of these people that are a bit radical in my taste. They are like a bit fanatics, but now and then you encounter serious analysis, criticizing particular policies, particular programs that are worth reading. So, keep an eye on these two websites if you want to have some exposure to the world against the World Bank and the IMF. I mean, you can find many other websites, but these are two interesting ones. All right, let me make a pause here. Any questions, any comments? Chat, it looks like you're struggling not to say something. What's going on, man?
All right. Well, I gotta show I can't hide it. The IMF has I picture $1 one vote as like a chairman of the board for a company, like I might own a couple shares of Amazon, but I don't call any shots over there because there's bigger, it's not my money. I mean, some of it, but it I don't, I'm trying to, in my head, think of an alternative, and meanwhile listen as we go forward. But the IMF, it's their money, and those rich countries sent the money as, I guess, sort of a, not a charity, a global stimulant to help them as well in the long run. But it is their money. So it's, I guess, I don't know what Latin Americans could want besides literally a blank check. Hey, we need some money. I think it's about $10 billion. Write us a check. We'll send it to the right place. It's our country. We know where it goes. But from the countries giving the money's point of view, how on earth, how could that work?
Yeah, no, I hear you. I mean, it's like it should be like any other bank. You're going to make some loans to people, places, institutions, companies, whatever you name it, only and only if you know they are going to be able to pay you back. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a good, smart business decision, right? Yeah. Let me hear Cody. I think you had your hand up. Sorry, Cody.
Yeah, it's just like a counterpoint to that. I mean, the IMF and the World Bank don't really, like, their whole sort of mantra, at least what they're trying to propose, is that they're not specifically representing one or a set of countries. So, I mean, just because one country puts in more money, like I see the argument that the US is putting in much more money than other countries would, so they would want sort of sway. But it would make more sense in my mind if the IMF leaned into that, but they're trying to refute that and say that they're more of a world based organization or supranational organization. But instead, it just seems like they're representing the interests of the people that provide their money, which, I mean, depending on how you view it, I mean, at the very least, if they were transparent about that, then maybe it would be sort of less detrimental to their sort of image.
Right. You know, one way, let me make this comment, Jacob, and then I'll let you go next. But one way that could help to frame this analysis is this analogy. So think about for-profit and non-for-profit companies. So obviously a for-profit company, that's the goal of a company. You are after making money, period, right? Now, a non-for-profit organization has a different mission, right? Not necessarily make lots of money, even if you have to, face some losses. The idea is to impact a particular situation, right? Now, at the international level, many people think of the, private lenders, the Chase Manhattans, JP Morgans, the Bank of Tokyo, all these financial institutions as for-profit. That's what they do. But the World Bank and the IMF portray themselves as non-for-profit type of institutions. They are pro-sustainability. They are pro-environmental things. And the criticism is that they are not practicing what they preach, because they typically impose these conditions when countries are in a weak financial situation, and they produce this race to the bottom effect, that lowers the standards, environmental, labor standards. So the criticism is that, okay, guys, if you, let's say the US or Canada or Germany, don't want to be part of it, pull out. If you don't want to lose any money, pull out. You can actually make money through your other financial institutions, and that's the argument, that they should be practicing what they preach, and it seems like they are not. Jacob.
Yeah, mine was just kind of a quick comment based on what they were saying earlier, of just, if you were, like, say the World Bank or IMF was to kind of pursue that policy and like blanketly say, well, the people who are putting their money in get more say, I don't think they would have even close to the approval that they do, just because like their whole reason that people look up to them and respect them is because what you were saying, their status as kind of that nonprofit, that universal help. If they did kind of switch to that more for-profit kind of goal, although it might be more in line with what they're doing, they're not going to have the support, and they're probably going to have people pull out. they're not going to have that good image that they kind of rely on.
Right. Right. Dylan, seems like you're about to say something too.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I feel like there's kind of a moral hazard problem involved with letting the debtor countries kind of set the terms of their own loans, which is what would happen if you do like a population type of vote, or vote by one country, one vote, or something along those lines.
Yeah, it's like, you go into the bank and tell them, okay, you charge me only 1% interest rate, right? Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good. Cody, you have a comeback too.
Yeah, I agree with that point that debtors shouldn't be necessarily in charge of the loans they receive, but on the same sort of point, since the goals of these countries that are contributing to the IMF aren't necessarily always in line, having some sort of pseudo supranational organization like the IMF kind of like we've discussed, and how you've sort of alluded to that Latin America views the IMF and the World Bank as tools of the West. When you give the already developed and industrialized countries power over these countries, you just sort of end up in the sort of status quo that doesn't really move anything. And sort of like we were saying, like these countries that are funding the IMF, they don't necessarily have a reason outside of receiving money and profit from these countries when they're putting money into the IMF. So it's kind of like a net, like it's almost impossible for them to look bad, because when the IMF looks bad, I mean, the US can just say, well, that's not us, that's them. I mean, it's our money, but that's them. They make the choice.
Yeah. Well, keep in mind that all this, or most of this criticism, is coming from the fact that despite the implementation of all these policies, neoliberal policies, the Washington Consensus, although economic growth came back to Latin America, if you look at the growth rates of growth in the 1990s, they switched from negative to positive, which is a good thing. But the criticism is, what about the vast majority of the population? Poverty rates are still high, hunger is still high, all of these, non-traditional indicators are still not showing a lot of progress, right? In fact, and I'm going to use this as a segue to keep going. Many people argue, including some economists, let me bring this up. Many people argue that the reason the Washington Consensus policies did not work very well in Latin America is because they were, one, they were not pushed enough, and number two, because they were implemented incorrectly. Like, whoa, wait a second. So there is a very famous economist, Chilean economist. His name is Sebastian Edwards. He works, last time I checked, he was at UCLA in the ECON department. Pretty smart guy, but this is one of the guys that basically said, no, you're looking at this the wrong way, guys. It's not that the policies are bad. I mean, who in their right mind is going to be against free markets? Come on, what we need to do is to push the policies even further, deeper, wider, stronger. What are you talking about? Well, they're talking about a Washington Consensus 2.0, or the augmented Washington Consensus. So let me give you this box here. Daniel Roderick from Harvard University is another guy pushing for this, or at least not pushing for this, but collecting the ideas around this. So on the left, you have the original. Let me see if I can. Here is the original list that we already talked about. Liberalization, privatization, deregulation, all that. But the augmented Washington Consensus people argue that this was not enough because they were the recipe was incomplete. For the cake to be juicy and flavor, with lots of flavor and all, it required additional ingredients that were not present in the original recipe. Ingredients like what? Well, you can read the second list. We need to deal with corruption. we need to deal with legal and political reform, regulatory institutions, social safety nets. It's a huge amount of additional policies that were not part of the original package. So people argue that if from the beginning, all of these ingredients had been part of the package, the outcome of the neoliberal policies under the Washington Consensus would have produced not only economic growth, but also sustainable economic development, right? Now, the reason many people see this a bit, with a bit of skepticism is that they say, wait a minute, wait a minute. Is it possible, guys, that you are just using this just to keep wrapping these financial tentacles around the economies of Latin America, just to get deeper and have more control? I mean, it's an interesting argument. They claim this idea that, if you want these policies to work, you need to, add all these ingredients to the recipe. But many people see this with a lot of skepticism, and they say, wait a minute, no, that sounds like, giving the keys to the car to these guys, or even the keys to my house. Like, oh, man, I don't know if you want to do that or not, So let me see. Now, here is another element, food for thought, that adds to this skeptical attitude among many people in Latin America. The US and its friends, Germany and other European countries, Canada, have used the IMF and the World Bank to reward its allies or its friends, but also to punish their enemies. So, for example, if, say, Cuba or Iraq or, North Korea were knocking the door of the IMF and the World Bank and say, hey, we need financial assistance, well, they are going to say, forget it, no help for you, no assistance for you. In fact, they are going to use these two institutions plus the WTO, the World Trade Organization, to produce, for example, a long list of economic sanctions, but the most common one is a trade embargo. So no country is going to buy from you, and no country is going to sell you. The idea is that we want to choke your economy, domestic economy, so that the people in your country rebel against this, against your government. Maybe a revolution, maybe some civil war or whatever, and that's the idea of a trade embargo, right? To change the regime. In many cases, that's the goal. But the point is that many people in Latin America say, it's very clear, guys. You're using these as tools. You use these to reward your enemy, your friends, and punish your enemies. However, here is the a little bit of of the salt that you want to take this criticism with. For many Latin American politicians, presidents, ministers of finance, people in power, like I said before, it is really, really useful for political reasons to have this scapegoat. You have always somebody else to blame rather than taking responsibility. So the president of any particular country in Latin America that wants to be reelected, can always say, I'm sorry, guys, I'm doing the best I can, believe me, blah, blah, blah. But all of this ill and all of this disease and all of these, poor outcomes in terms of economic policy are not my doing. The IMF and the World Bank are calling the shots, because if we don't follow this, all this flow of resources is gone. My tanks are high. Just give me another chance. That type of thing. It's a very interesting position for people in power in Latin America because the presence of the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO in these countries allows them to deflect responsibility. And that is a bad thing for sure. That is not a good thing because it's very hard to distinguish who is actually behind all of these policies and of course the outcomes. Number three, oh, Chad, you have a comment. Please go ahead.
Yes, is there the option to decline this money? Or are things too dire to say, no, we don't want these conditions and the West owning us?
Yes, yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. Remember, balance of payment, the bucket. If you don't have foreign exchange and you need to buy food, medicine, equipment, you need to have access to these resources. But maybe like many countries, including say Venezuela, for example, Nicaragua right now, and others, because of the political regime they're under, completely against the concepts of freedom and democracy that govern the US and the West, they can always knock the door of a different pot of money, which is China, the Russians, and all that, right? The problem with that is that the US, as a matter of foreign policy, is going to see this as a huge threat. And then they are going to start imposing all sorts of, policies like trade embargoes, economic sanctions, and if necessary, military intervention, right? Because, we can, the argument is we cannot allow another Cuba in South America, like Venezuela, or in Central America, like Nicaragua. If we have to intervene, we're going to send the troops over there and kick these guys out, So I guess in a way, there is a way to reject the conditions and not to take the money if you have an alternative. But right now, the only alternative are, the other guys, right? the Russians, the Chinese. So obviously some countries have gone that way, have gone that route, right? Now, this is why, I don't remember if I mentioned this last class, but in 1999, 2000, I was living in Venezuela and I was working for CAF, the Andean Corporation of Development. So southern countries, this is perhaps one of the examples of integration where they created their own development bank, and on purpose, they don't let the US become a member. So you can go to caf.net. I can give you the link later. But the point is that if you look at the members, there are some European countries like Spain. Spain, I'm sure is there because of the nexus, and historical connections with Latin America. But the point is that the CAF is now making more loans than the Inter-American Development Bank, which is one of the Washington consensus. So it seems like finally some Latin American countries are figuring out ways to independently finance themselves rather than being dependent on either the US and its allies or the Soviets or the Chinese. It's happening, and not at the magnitude and speed that many people might wish, but it's happening. Good question. All right, let me finish this here. Okay. Now, I'm going to finish with this because this is the transition to the new left in Latin America. What are the electoral consequences of the Washington Consensus? And let me go straight to the conclusion. This is a very interesting and very famous paper by Laura and Oliveira, 2005. It's in your readings, where they conclude that the pro-market reforms, these Washington Consensus policies implemented in Latin America, carry, past tense, carry strong, large electoral cost, despite the fact of the good macroeconomic impacts. So the point that these guys are making is that, like I said, if you look at the aggregate numbers, GDP growth, exports, employment, the traditional indicators, man, the neoliberal policies worked. But if you look at if you look deeper into the indicators of economic development, access to electricity, sewage, drinkable water, poverty, all of these indicators that go deeper into the social tissue of the population, they didn't work. And this is why these guys say, despite the fact of the seemingly counterintuitive result that, okay, the policies work at the macroeconomic level, many incumbents, I'm talking about presidents in Latin America, implementing these policies, lost the election, lost to this new left movement like Chavez, like Ortega in Nicaragua, like many other. I'm going to give you a PowerPoint presentation after the after the exam next week, where I'm going to give you names, numbers, and all of that. But the point is, unfortunately, for macroeconomic policy, now that and again, I'm not trying to sway you anyway in any direction, but now that the new left took over, some of the gains in terms of aggregate macroeconomic indicators vanished. Case in point, think about Venezuela, think about Bolivia, all these countries once again, after a long time of hope and after a long time of what seemed to be like, okay, finally they are going to get their act together, whether it is the left or the right or whatever, we are going to discover that in most of these cases, unfortunately, like I said, Latin America is still the place of the of the forever future. The future that never comes. The IMF and the World Bank made promises that didn't materialize. The new left has been making promises and they are not happening either. So this is like, the forever future, right? The land of the forever future. And then there is another paper in your readings by the Whelan that basically says, well, it's a mixed record, which is the point I'm trying to make. The available evidence, I'm going straight to the conclusion, suggests that neoliberalism has been a mixed blessing for Latin American economies. Because like I said, thanks to many of these policies, more efficient and more market-based processes were implemented. And those allow the Latin American economies to finally being able to open up to compete with the rest of the world. And that's something really positive, because it didn't happen like what happened in Africa, that they are way too behind. In Latin America, I mean, you have, Brazil with a seat in the space station, building their own planes, Mexico with the car manufacturing industry, and many other smaller countries, Costa Rica with tourism, and a few others, right? The point is that, it's a mixed blessing, because on the one hand, it worked to achieve all these, interesting and positive outcomes. On the other hand, unfortunately, all these benefits, we are still struggling to make sure that all of these benefits are shared among the population in Latin America. And that's the challenge right now. How can we ensure that all these benefits produced by these market-based policies reach the most, that they are not concentrated in just a few families, right? That is the challenge right now. Anyway, comments, questions? Let me see. Nobody?
Yeah, I had a question about CAF.
Yes.
So when Latin American countries reach out to CAF to for loans, does the US retaliate in the same way they would if they reached out to other countries like Russia and China?
No, not really, because the capital, the fund of money is not coming from Russia or China. So if you look at the CAF website, the US is not there, but China, North Korea, or Russia are not there either, right? So the idea is truly figuring out the most independent way to finance themselves. You know, Spain is kind of an anomaly, but remember, because of the historical relationship between Latin America and Spain, it's just a natural thing. You know, there are millions of people from Latin America living in Spain, and literally million people from Spain living in Latin America. So the financial, the family connections first, but also the financial connections between these two regions of the world are still, you know, really, really big. So it's a natural business partner for Latin America. But no, as far as I know, there is no retaliation because, you know, the CAF is not imposing or conditioning the funding in a similar way that the Chinese of the Soviets might do. You know, like for example, one exception. Well, not that one exception. You know, I think I already mentioned the. I think they stopped right now. I'll have to go back and check. But the Chinese want to build another canal to compete with the Panama Canal that is under, you know, the U.S. jurisdiction right now. I mean, if you look at a picture of Panama, Panama City, it looks like New York, smaller, but looks like New York. I mean, in Panama, they don't have their own currency. They use dollars, U.S. dollars. It's a completely dollarized country, right? So for the Chinese, this is like, no way, no way. They want to build their own canal. And then they went after Nicaragua to see if they could figure out the way. And of course, they are you know, injecting capital, but also some conditions, right? Some conditions. CAF, they don't do that. They don't do that. This is a strict financial institution, non-for-profit, with the exclusive goal of finance economic development in the region. So they claim. Who knows what's going to happen if they keep getting power, you know, financial power. You know, that's the other thing. You know, when we don't have the money, you say, oh, if I had $1 billion, I would be doing such and such and such. I would be the nicest guy on earth. Well, I don't know. I mean, really? You know, I would like to see that, you know, because when you have $1 billion, your whole perspective, your friends, your structure, your life changes, right? So keeping true to yourself, I'm sure is a challenge. So I don't know, maybe CAF for now is doing well. If they keep gaining power, financial power to compete with the IMF and the World Bank, either they, you know, become not so good, or they are going to be challenged seriously now by the IMF and the World Bank. I don't know. We just need to keep an eye on these guys. Yep.
And in terms of the mixed blessing idea that you talked about, what's the response from neoliberalists in terms of income inequality and poverty rates, considering a lot of the westernized countries that push these neoliberal ideas haven't solved that problem themselves?
Yeah, well, like I said, the typical argument is, one, the policies were not implemented correctly, and number two, there were some missing ingredients. For example, they blame the huge amount of corruption. They blame the poor human capital infrastructure, not just the physical infrastructure, but the human capital infrastructure. You don't have a skill, you know, highly skilled labor force. You know, all this institutional framework is missing, like the property rights are missing, taxation issues, all of these things, they argue, had they been fixed, you know, at the same time as we were implementing these policies, the outcome would have been different. But because they were missing, well, there you have it. You know, it's your fault. You should have been working on this while we were working on our end of things, injecting capital and fixing this. It's a very comfortable position. I mean, I don't buy it completely. Although I mean, it's clear that if you compare the experience of Latin America with East Asia, like I said before, East Asia, the tigers, the dragons, were successful because they took care of these two important elements that Latin America completely missed. One, they made a significant investment in human capital, health, and education that Latin America didn't. And number two, this protection was actually removed at the right time. In Latin America, they just keep the bubble protecting domestic industry, and they never learned, they never grew up. So when you look at the experience of East Asia, it sounds like this missing ingredients argument has some validity, I'm not sure I buy the whole thing, but there is some elements that can be rescued there. Okay, guys, I'm over time now. We can continue with this conversation on Wednesday, okay? Please come to class so that we discuss these things, and I'll give you ideas, hints for the exam on Friday, all right? Thank you, I'm gonna stop recording now.